Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm a quitter. And my God, I hate this! If you saw my May book roundup, I talked about the 10 books that I read this May. What I didn't talk about was the 2 books this May that I quit on. And I'd like to talk about that. I want to talk about the dreaded DNFs today, the did not finish, those books that we couldn't make it through. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is why it's okay to quit on a book and when I think is the right time to do so. And then I'm going to give you some examples of books that I've quit on in the last year. The 2 from last month and 2 from last year. And a couple of them will be surprises. One is a major bestseller that is universally loved, and one is by one of my absolute favorite authors. Before we get started, if you like this video, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you hit the bell icon, you get a notification whenever I upload another video, which I do about 3 times per month. So let's talk about why I think it's okay to quit on a book. About 20 years ago, I was reading a book that I was hating. I was not enjoying this book. It was a long book, and I am not someone that likes to quit things. I like to see things through. Up until this point, I don't know if there were any books that I'd ever quit on, save a few that I was required to read in high school, but we won't talk about that. So I told myself, well, I'm going to push through. A lot of people like this book. I'll get to the end. I'll feel the great accomplishment. I'll be really happy about, pushing on through and finishing that book. And I got to the end and I had none of those feelings. There was no cathartic relief of, wow, I just finished this book. It was more disappointment than anything. At the time, I was averaging about a book a month. And I thought of the 5 or 6 books I probably could have read instead of slogging through this book that I absolutely never enjoyed. So then and there I said that it was okay for me to quit on a book, as long as I give it enough chance. So, and I think that's the important component of quitting on a book. I think it's important that you do give the book a chance. Reading a chapter and saying, no, I don't feel that you've given that book or that author a fair shot at catching you and catching your attention to read the book. A lot of books, take their time at the start to establish things. So I think it's important that we read a little bit more than one chapter. So how much, I guess, is the big question here. I recently read a blog post, a couple years ago, and it was interesting. The blogger had a mathematical formula for when to quit on a book, and it was 100 minus your age. That's how many pages you had to read. And I thought that was interesting because it was just impressing upon you that a younger reader who's still developing his or her tastes may not recognize the genre or the author and the things they like about it yet, so they need to give a book a little bit more of a chance. Whereas a much older reader who knows what they like, knows pretty early on in a book if they're going to enjoy it or not in most cases, and frankly has less books left in their lifetime, is allowed to quit on a book earlier. Well, I thought that was all fine and good, but I'm a big fan of the acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid. So my keep it simple, stupid method for DNFs is 1 hour. I give a book an hour to catch my attention, to help me determine whether or not it's something I want to continue reading. Now, this isn't a put the stopwatch on, read for an hour, stopwatch goes off, do I want to continue or not? No, I just make sure if I get to the point where I'm thinking, do I want to keep reading this book? I make sure that I've read at least an hour. So for me, most books, that's 50 to 70 pages, depending on, the size of the book and the size of the font. So your pages may vary. I also try to do it in one reading session. I find that if I read for a half hour one day and I'm not hooked yet, it kind of sits in my mind that I'm not enjoying the book. And then that second reading session is kind of tainted a little bit, where it wouldn't be so extreme if it were one sitting. So especially if I'm reading a new author or a genre that I don't read as often, I try to give that book 1 solid hour of my attention when I start, just to get myself really into the book. And most of the time, that's all it takes for me. I don't DNF a lot of books. I probably average maybe 3 or 4 books a year as a DNF. As a comparison, last year I read 105 books, so it's a very small percentage. But I have found in the past that I have not regretted any of the DNFs. So let's talk about those. So let's start with the 2 that I DNF'd last year. The first was Anxious People by Frederick Backman. And this is the newest from a very famous author that a lot of people love. And my book club was reading this one, so I wanted to read this, obviously, to be able to discuss it with them. And I had hoped to finish it to be able to discuss it with them. But I was reading this one, and the thing about this book that I was not enjoying was I hated every single character. I really did. There was not a single character that I was invested in, that I was rooting for, that I liked. So that made this book kind of tough. And then about halfway through the book, so probably 200, 250 pages into the book, the most preposterous scene happened, and I just held up the book and said, "My God, I hate this." And I stopped reading right there, and I don't regret it. Talking with my book club later that month, they had all read it. I was the only DNF. None of them gave it much of a glowing endorsement, although they did say the second half was a lot better than the first half. So I don't regret that. However, they told me about a different book of Bachman's called Beartown. So I figured that I would read Beartown next. That's a very universally loved book. It's got extremely high ratings anywhere you see it. And I see the appeal. This is another one that I read halfway through before I DNF'd. Beartown is about one of those sad small towns that are entirely too wrapped up in their youth sports, in this case hockey. And this year their youth hockey team is doing really, really well because they have a fantastic star in the making. Well, about halfway through the book, this hockey star in this scene that was unfolding was going to rape a teenage girl. Nope, wasn't going to read that. And even as much as I didn't want to read the scene that was unfolding, I knew what the aftermath was going to be. That you would have people in this town supporting the rapist because he was a hockey star. And I didn't want to read it. I have a good friend that tells me it ends well and told me to continue. And everybody I've talked to tells me how great the book is, but just wasn't going to do it. It's just not the book for me. So if you love Bachman, my apologies for giving two Bachman examples here, but those were the two books I DNF'd last year. So let's talk about this May. Let's talk about the two books that I DNF'd this May, because these were two authors that I'd read before and enjoyed before. The first was The Trespasser by Tana French. Tana French writes these great books about the Dublin Murder Squad, these detectives set in Dublin, Ireland, which is so refreshing. It seems like so many detective stories are set in New York City or Los Angeles, and it just gets so banal reading the same setting all the time. And I think that's one of the reasons I came back to these books so much, was I enjoyed the setting so much. One of the books I loved, absolutely loved The Likeness by Tana French. The others were kind of middling, and I know that the fifth book was a DNF for me as well. The strength and weakness of this series is it follows different detectives as the protagonists in each book. So if you're not liking the protagonist, that can kind of sink the book. And that's kind of what happened with me on The Trespasser. Although I read a lot of this book. Starting out this book, it was okay. It was two junior detectives, but as I got into it, I just realized they were bumbling. I wanted Harry Bosch from the Michael Connelly novels to just sweep in and solve this thing. He would have finished the book in like 60 pages. I've read enough detective stories to know that you follow the evidence, you don't jump to radical, outlandish theories, and that's exactly what they were doing. So that was driving me a bit crazy. But as I got further into this book, the protagonist just became less and less likable. And I got to a point, I was reading on my Kindle, so it tells you how many hours you have left. And I think I'd read 5 hours of this book, and I had about 4 hours left. And I asked myself, I said, do I want to spend 4 more hours with this protagonist? And the answer was no. So I quit the book right there, and I have no regrets. And on to my last example. One of my favorite authors is Kate Atkinson. So when I was going to read Emotionally Weird, I was excited because I had only read 4 Kate Atkinson books up to this point. She's one of my all-time favorite authors. Right up there, A God in Ruins. That is my favorite book of all time. I love her prose. I love how in her literary fiction stories, there is so much more to the story than what she is telling you. This is the only one of these 4 examples that I only read an hour and I put it down. I did break my rule though. I read a half hour one day and a half hour the next day. One of the things I don't like in books, for some reason, and this is just a personal thing, is I don't like overly witty characters. For some reason, seeing these people on the page, it just strikes as false. You know, most of them, if I met them in real life, I'd probably want to hang out with them all the time because they were so witty. But I don't like the overly witty characters that you see in books. And this was essentially every single character was trying to be wittier than one another, because it was one of those books about a writer's group and their professors and the students, and everyone was trying to show off how witty they were. And I just said, this is going to be one of those self-indulgent writer books that I just don't want to read, so I put it down. Now, you notice I still own the book. I'll give this one another shot in a year. I think the author that wrote my favorite book of all time deserves a second shot. So I'll put it away until 2022, come back to it. If I DNF again, you know, I'll take it to Half Price Books and sell it back. If not, maybe I'll read it, maybe I'll like it, maybe I won't, but we'll see a year from now. So that's my little discussion on DNFs. I would love to hear in the comments below if you have any rules about this. If you're someone who never quits on a book, if you quit on a book and you don't have any rules, I'd love to hear that too. I guess my personality, I have to have some sort of rule for it for me to follow it. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Goodreads. If you follow me on Goodreads, I actually have a separate shelf on my profile of all the books I've DNF'd. So you can go there, look at them, tell me what I'm wrong about, come back here and let me know in the comments. As always, thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.